Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get you teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to start with, I've got a few big threads to just go through today. I'm going to start with a medium-sized thread from Trent Telenko, who's always interested in logistics. That's what his kind of work was previously with the armed forces in the US. So, all right, it's time for another adventure in logistical enablers in the latest US arms shipment to Ukraine. Specifically, look at this line: 8 heavy fuel trucks and 105 fuel trailers. The heavy fuel truck could only be and I'll just get the pictures up for you. Could only be the US Army's M978 heavy tactical fuel truck. Now, these are super important. You can't do a counteroffensive without the logistical lines behind, without those supply to those very fuel hungry vehicles like tanks. I've talked about these logistical enablers of heavy mechanized offensives previously on Twitter. And he goes on to say the 105 fuel trailers offer several possibilities. This 7,500 gallon petroleum tank semi trailer behind an M1088 FMT semi tractor is one possibility. See the global security link he provides. And that's, a significant piece of machinery there. The modular fuel system on the PLS truck trailer tank rack module mounted on a M1076 PLS trailer is another, and he goes on to show that modular system. And then he sort of comes towards the end saying the lowest end of possibility is this dismantleable tank and pump unit used in the US Army FMTV trailer fleet. Much smaller bit of kit there. I think the 7,500 gallon petroleum tank semi trailer is the most likely for that military aid line. As a semi-tractor connections are universal, and Ukraine has access to semi-tractors in the European Union militaries and economy to pull them. The next several weeks will tell, which we will see lines of them in the Ukrainian counterattack logistical trains. Ukraine's big cats will prowl on megatons of diesel fuel delivered by these trailers. In other words, it's super important to get those bits of kit out. I'm quite surprised that they were announced this late. However, quite often you'll find that these things get announced after they've been delivered. So there's every possibility that these logistical pieces of equipment have been delivered already. Right, moving on, just going to talk about UK expenditure as a share of GDP on the military. And you can see, high in 1982 around the Falklands War. And then a little peak again here. That looks like the first Gulf War, but basically a huge downward trend as the UK has not been involved in war so much over those years, just part of kind of NATO forces and whatnot, doing bits and pieces here and there. And then comes down to 1997 at the end of this downward trend, the Labour government gets in there, and you've got it drops to its lowest. Actually, its lowest much more recently. So 2004, then sort of popped up a little bit, and then just before the Tories came back in, it was up at 2.5% of GDP. Then the Conservatives came in, and David Cameron was the PM then, and got a bit of a hassle for not spending enough as a percentage of GDP on the armed forces by the US, by NATO. And so what he did was move pensions that military personnel were getting into like what was how the figure got collated. And that pushed the figures up a little bit. But then since then, it's come down, and then 2.1% has been the lowest, and that was from sort of 2015 to 2020. And then had a little bit of a spike, and it's interesting. It will be interesting to see where it goes now with all this pressure, with 5 billion extra being promised, I think. But even that, some argue, was not enough. But that tells, pictures tell 1,000 words. Look at that downward trend there. Now, you can't really argue with that. In peacetime, you're not going to be spending as much on it. You've got other things to worry about. You're not going to be selling the idea of spending loads on defense when you're not at war. to your general public who want it to be spent on education, welfare, hospitals, all this kind of stuff. So you do understand this, but of course, then the argument is, well, when you do come to need this, suddenly these things often happen quite suddenly, and it's like, oh, suddenly there's a war in Ukraine. Okay, we need all this stuff. Oh, we don't have it. But it's difficult to sell that to a public who have experienced not that much war and are in periods of peacetime. So, yeah, trying to understand these things from both sides, I guess. Right, long Mick Ryan thread. For those who follow the provision of United States military assistance to Ukraine closely over the past several months, a new pattern. If I can get the words up, a new pattern in support has emerged. A key aspect of this new pattern is the provision of battlefield mobility capabilities. Reviewing the multiple US aid packages since October 2022, there's been a large effort, to equip combat engineers in their coming efforts to identify, reduce, and remove the dense obstacle zones constructed by the Russian army in eastern and southern Ukraine. Demolitions, munitions, obstacle reduction, and mine clearance equipment, mobile bridging capabilities, as well as mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles and artillery-delivered anti-tank mines have featured in the publicly released lists of American-supplied military assistance. This uplift in mobility and survivability support to the Ukrainian army tells us that not only have battlefield conditions changed since the beginning of the war, but that the coming offensives by the Ukrainians will look different to those that have previously been conducted. The first reason for this is that the Ukrainians are facing a different Russian army now than compared to 2022. Not only does it have a different commander in General Gerasimov, but there is a different balance of professional and mobilized troops. While much ink has been spilled about how mobilized troops are better at defensive than offensive operations, the reality is that the coordination of a scheme of defense over several hundred kilometers of front line is still a complex and fraught undertaking. The Russians have constructed multiple layers in their defensive zones. Some of these will be augmented with obstacles including anti-tank ditches, mines, wire, and dragon's teeth. There will be different densities of troops in each zone. We can reasonably assume that the Russians will have reserves in troops and munitions for counter-attack and counter-penetration missions across the front line. They will have an ISR plan focused on detecting and interdicting concentrations of Ukrainian troops. Now, this is all absolutely bang on. The Ukrainians need as much of this stuff as they can get for their counteroffensive. The bridges, they're only bridging equipment for heavy tanks. The Ukrainian or the NATO tanks like the Challenger and the Abrams, or not, they're going to be using Abrams, and the Leopard 2 are heavier tanks, particularly the Challenger 2. Now, I do worry. I mean, I think these defenses will be a problem. I know some people laugh at these defenses and you can get around them and get in behind them, but they are going to present an obstacle, obviously, for the Ukrainians. They will slow the Ukrainian counteroffensive down. I'm particularly worried about the Russians accumulating munitions to send wholesale at the Ukrainians. Once the Ukrainians accumulate in areas which they have to do in order to commit to a counteroffensive, at some point there's going to be a large number of troops and equipment in one general area. I think the Russians are going to absolutely hammer them with things like cruise missiles. I mean, I genuinely worry that the Ukrainians will potentially get absolutely hammered by all sorts of munitions that you wouldn't expect to be used against those kinds of targets. We've not seen cruise missiles used as much recently by the Russians. Could it be that they're stockpiling them to be used in a way that we wouldn't expect them to use, which is directly against, troops and equipment rather than really big installations and critical infrastructure, so on and so forth? I do genuinely worry about that. Mick Ryan continues. Just to let you know, he's a retired Australian general. While this might paint a picture of Russian military professionalism that has rarely been glimpsed in this war, it is militarily prudent to make some assumptions along these lines. It is always better to prepare for a more dangerous opponent rather than a less dangerous one. Another difference with the coming offensives will be Ukrainian force structure. Over the past few months, they have been raising, equipping, manning, and training 3 new formations for the coming offensive. These new formations, which are unlikely to resemble reinforced combined arms divisions, have probably been the beneficiaries of the large numbers of armoured and motorised equipment provided by the US and Europe in the last few months. The new division size organisations introduce a new and more complex combined arms formation to the Ukrainian order of battle. They are much more capable, but it will take time to train commanders and staff to employ them effectively. That said, the Ukrainians have demonstrated continuously throughout this war how quickly they can absorb new knowledge and systems. I expect something similar with their uptake of division level operations. A third difference from what has come before is a dense series of obstacle zones that the Russians have constructed in Ukraine. Good armies try to avoid being committed to breaching through such areas because that is exactly what the enemy wants you to do. However, if they lie in a path of an important operational objective, there are times when breaching and fighting through such obstacle zones cannot be avoided, and there should be no doubt about the complexity of such operations. Indeed, there is no military endeavour that is more difficult to plan, orchestrate, and execute than combined arms obstacle breaching. It requires every element of an army's combined arms team and air forces to overcome them and proceed to taking an objective. And this is kind of what I've been saying. Some people may laugh at these obstacles, but they will present a really meaningful challenge for the Ukrainian offensives. A fourth reason why the future offensives will be different is because both sides have continuously evolved and improved capabilities for reconnaissance and strike. Both sides now employ an almost countless number of drones of many types, as well as loitering munitions. The number and density of such systems has increased throughout the war. Both sides now operate in an environment of almost pervasive surveillance, where the detection and destruction time has been significantly reduced. So that means that basically the time between when you see something and you blow it up is much shorter. So things need to be moving all the time. If you shoot and scoot is really important because 3 minutes and you can be here, or indeed you can detect something and destroy it straight away if it's an IED drop from a drone. So you've got drones prowling around ready to drop explosives, and they spot something and they destroy it. So that time is now negligible in some cases. Of course, they carry much smaller IEDs, but there will become a time when those drones are prowling around with much more potent IEDs on board. This means that deception before the operation will be vital, says Ryan, for the Ukrainians to conceal key objectives and axes of advance, logistics holdings, troop concentrations, as well as the locations of critical items such as engineer, equipment, and artillery. This is something I talked about last week, which is what I worry about in the counteroffensive is these accumulations, like I was talking about before, vulnerable to be hit with big missiles. Just the fact that they can be detected at all is an issue. Hiding where you are accumulating to not only hide where you're going to be attacking, but keep the troops and equipment safe is super important. A final reason the coming offensives will be different is because of the strategic stakes involved. The Russians seek to draw out the conflict. I actually think this is a flawed assumption on Putin's part, but that is another article. The Ukrainians know that the strategic clock is possibly ticking in Washington, D.C., with an election year likely to distract the war principle aid provided in 2024. This year will be decisive for Ukrainian battlefield operations. The offensives to come must once again show the people of the West that not only is Ukraine worth supporting, but with ongoing military assistance in 2023 and beyond, they can defeat the Russian invasion. Whether launched tomorrow or next month, the Ukrainian offensives will be different to those we have already seen, but the Ukrainians will continue to show us that their sense of purpose, adaptive mindset, pride in defending Ukraine makes them unbeatable. Yeah, and so ending with a real positive there, but it will be challenging, and we just hope that obviously they have the correct equipment to do the business there. Right, let's go on to the third part of the Crimea series. I've been reading you Chris O, who is an independent military history author and researcher, and he was talking us through the history and geography of Crimea up to modern times, and it's been really interesting so far. I've really enjoyed learning about Crimea. This is a third in a short series of threads exploring the military history of Crimea, which may soon become a battlefield again as Ukraine seeks to recapture it. In this part, I'll be looking at the Ukrainian conquest of Crimea in 1918 and the Red Army's reconquest in 1920. For the first part on Crimea's military geography, see his first thread. And the second part, which was the history from 75 to 7071. See the second part. You can see them on my previous extra videos. Please check them out. The 1917 Russian Revolution sparked a civil war across the former Russian Empire and political chaos in Crimea. Between December 1917 and November 1920, it was successively ruled by Crimea's People's Republic, the Taurida Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian People's Republic, the First and Second Crimean regional governments, and the Crimean Socialist Soviet Republic, the South Russian government, and the government of South Russia. And of course, aptly plays a little gif of The Life of Brian, Monty Python's brilliant film. Judea People's Front, ha! We're the People's Front of Judea. So on and so forth. Splitter. The Bolshevik takeover was resisted by the White Movement, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, and by local nationalist movements, which established their own People's Republics in several regions. A short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, was created in 1918 with German backing. It aspired to capture Bolshevik-controlled Crimea, but Germany also wanted the peninsula as a stepping stone to the Caucasus oil fields in support of their war effort in the West. The Ukrainians were determined to get to Crimea first, so in April 1918, the UNR forces under Colonel Petro Bolbochan mounted an audacious invasion on the peninsula. Bolbochan led the Bolsheviks to believe that he would attack across the strongly defended Perekop Isthmus, the one that we've learnt about so much, which is the one to the west. This is Perekop. Then we've got the Chonha Isthmus, and then you've got the Arabit Spit, which is not, well, at the time wasn't bridged up in the north. So he led the Bolsheviks to believe they would attack the strongly defended Perekop Isthmus, but instead led his force of 9,000 men to the Chonha railway bridge, which carried the Mariupol-Simferopol railway across the Sivash. The Sivash, if you remember, is this very shallow, salty marshes and lakes that, I guess, protect Crimea somewhat from the north. 5,000 men of the Red Army were dug in and entrenched on the Crimean side, opposite the Chonha Peninsula. On the night of the 21st to the 2nd of April, Bolbochan launched a lightning attack on their positions on the far side of the bridge. 20 Cossacks with light machine guns crossed the bridge under cover of darkness on a large Drezin or rail car, and routed Bolshevik forces on the other side before they could blow up the bridge. 2 armoured trains followed, machine gunning the Bolshevik trenches alongside the railway line and sending the Red Army soldiers fleeing. By the morning of the 22nd of April, the Ukrainians were in full control of the bridge. Bolbochan advanced to the rail junction of Jankoy, and this is a place that we've heard a lot about recently. The Ukrainians have hit there repeatedly with drones and possibly other munitions, as it is a rail hub, a logistics hub that feeds Simferopol, Sevastopol, and other areas of Crimea, as well as vice versa. So, Bolbochan advanced on to the rail junction of Jankoy by the evening and divided his force to capture the southern Crimean ports. At the same time, 30,000 men of German 52nd Division under Robert Koch smashed through the Bolshevik defenses at Perekop in a single day. Again, why this is interesting, or important to learn about, is what can we see about what previous forces have done as to how the Ukrainians might take Crimea if indeed they do. I think it's going to be too difficult for them to do in the foreseeable future, and I think the Ukrainians are more likely to cut off Crimea and hammer it with ordnance from a distance, making it untenable to remain there. Anyway, Bolbochan never made it to his objective at Crimea. The Germans ordered the Ukrainians to leave and establish a short-lived puppet state in Crimea that lasted until the German collapse in November 1918. By 1920, the peninsula was in the hands of the White Movement. The Whites' military leader in the south, Pyotr Wrangel, attempted to lead an offensive from Crimea towards the Dnieper and Donbass in September to October 1920. Wrangel's offensive was defeated by the Red Army's southern front under Mikhail Frunze. He was driven back into the peninsula and retreated behind the fortifications at Perekop, which he made even more formidable. The Whites had 3 lines of fortifications: the Old Tatar Ditch, which Wrangel had deepened and steepened, a line of trenches and emplacements in front of it, the outpost 2 kilometres beyond that. It was guarded by 750 machine guns, 180 artillery pieces, and an armoured train. Fortifications had also been constructed 20 kilometres further south in the Ishan area, another natural choke point created by 3 lakes just to the east and the Black Sea to the west. The bridges on the Chonhar Peninsula, so that's here, connecting the Ukrainian mainland to Crimea, had been blown up, and more defences had been built on the Crimean side. The Arabat Spit was guarded from the sea by the White-controlled Azov Sea Fleet and on land by the Cossack regiments. Wrangel claimed that the Crimea is impregnable. However, he was hugely outnumbered. Frunze had vast numerical superiority, 100,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry against Wrangel's 33,000 men. Wrangel had about 10,000 men at Perekop, 3,000 at Chonhar, 6,000 in reserve, and the rest either on the Arabat Spit or fighting Bolshevik partisans within Crimea. He also had around 200 artillery pieces, 1,500 machine guns, 5 armoured trains, 20 armoured cars, and 3 tanks. Although Frunze had a nearly 3-to-1 artillery advantage, artillery did not play a major role in the offensive, largely due to the inadequacies of his own artillery commanders, and air power was not a factor. Frunze, who obviously knew his military history, wanted initially to invade Crimea via the Arabat Spit, just as Peter Lacy had done in 1737. However, he had to abandon his plan as the Reds' Azov Sea Fleet was unable to leave its base at Taganrog due to sea ice. Without naval support, an advance along the Spit would have been hopelessly exposed. Frunze therefore switched to making a frontal assault at Chonhar and Perekop, with a main effort at Perekop. Frunze divided his force at Perekop in 2, taking advantage of a strong westerly wind and low tide. Part of his force was able to ford the Sivash after 10 o'clock at night on the 7th of November 1920 and wade around 5 kilometers to the lightly defended Litovsky Peninsula. Inexplicably, the Reds did not coordinate their attack against the Litovsky Peninsula with their main effort at Perekop. It was not until 1 o'clock in the afternoon on 8th of November that the assault was launched. It was a disaster. A frontal charge into machine gun emplacements with a little artillery support because of their commanders' incompetence, inexperience, and a lack of coordination with the artillery. Some Red units suffered 60% casualties. Frunze called upon reserves and managed to make a breakthrough on the 9th of November. His other forces attacked from the Chonhar Peninsula at midnight on the 10th to 11th of November using log rafts to cross the narrow strait and infiltrate the White defences under the cover of darkness. The Whites fell back from Perekop to their second line of defences at Ishan, and the Reds pursued them to Ishan. The Whites feigned a retreat, then confronted them with 150 Tachanki, horse-drawn wagons carrying machine guns, which mowed down the Red cavalry. So that looks pretty devastating against cavalry, I guess, Gatling guns like that or machine guns. So the defensive line at Ishan enabled the Whites to hold off the Reds for a few more days while inflicting heavy casualties on them. However, Wrangel realised the war was lost as the Whites could not hold off the Reds for long. There was also no realistic possibility of them holding off the Reds on the plains of central Crimea. The entire region north of the coastal mountains in the south is flat and featureless, and lacks any natural lines of defence or cover. By this time, the army was also demoralised, short of men, and had lost many of its weapons, making a stand at Sevastopol pointless. Wrangel ordered a retreat to Sevastopol during the night of the 11th to 12th of November. From there, his army used the remains of the Russian Black Sea Fleet to evacuate itself to safety in Constantinople, Istanbul, and eventually asylum in France. The Reds made a leisurely advance to Sevastopol and took the remainder of the peninsula with little resistance. They had won, but at a very high price. They suffered around 10,000 casualties against the 2,000 sustained by Wrangel's forces. Frunze had essentially won through sheer mass, so kind of Pyrrhic victory, but it didn't matter actually because they'd actually won. So it wasn't quite a Pyrrhic victory. We didn't leave them then vulnerable to that counterattack. He was proclaimed a hero, and the victory became a key moment for the Red Army. It's still commemorated by the diorama in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. In my next threads, I'll look at the much bloodier battles in World War II and Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union invading and reconquering Crimea, and then draw some conclusion for today's situation. So there you go, a little bit more history together with some geography of Crimea and how it has been the focus of attacks over history. We'll deal with a couple more attacks and then consider the ramifications for the Ukrainian attack that may or may not come there. And finally, today, I'm going to leave you with just a bit of sheer joss for these Ukrainian soldiers who had a rocket, something like a Smerchel Grad rocket by the looks of it, land right next to them, but it didn't explode. Wow. And of course, those guys are kind of laughing about that, but that would have been pretty much certain death for those ones, certainly on the outside. Wow. And it landed sort of just there. Incredible. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all of the support you guys give to the channel. I know I put out a lot of content. You don't have to watch it all. It's not for everyone. But for those who do enjoy it, it's here. And thank you for being a part of this. Take care. Speak soon.